but I'm going to start with a poem called Velvet and Pins, and you'll see what I wrote a lot. I guess I'm talking a lot, but when I was 12, I guess, I was born with a genetic kind of form, a genetic illness that manifests as kind of rickets. And I had a sort of very transformational surgery when I was about 12. And that's what this poem, the background of this poem is kind of about. Is it the 8 titanium pins around my knees? Or the fact that for 3 months, the incisions were left open? I grew to know that plush of inside, the velvets, the iodine to prevent infection, the smooth of body cast, like another girl who is exactly my shape, but calmer than I would ever be. She lay still, barely shifting, like a vase holding a flower, which was me with my hot dangers, my itchy despairs. In the myth, the girl who is spring only gets her power when she chooses the mask of bone. I did not want the world to be this way. For weeks, I stared at the dull view out the window of alleys in moonlight, a few sunken garages, a dirty white cat. I stared until these things became beautiful again. Something closed inside me, which glinted like a sharp, bright pin. The next poem I'm going to read about is sort of similar, and it's actually brand new, which is always exciting to read something brand new, kind of like the high wire stepping out. And this poem is called It's a List of What I Cannot Touch. I guess I've been writing a lot about aging lately, and one of the strange things I think about getting older is that you start sort of reassessing or thinking, memory becomes really important, and kind of trying to kind of do a sort of archive of where you've been or where you were in the world. So this is kind of a list poem that sort of touches on that. And also on this sort of theme of bodily kind of transformation. It's a list of what I cannot touch: the leather brace, the bedpan, the mirror's rippled surface, gold where the silver has been exposed, the pond, the carp with their huge blown mouths, their bodies that were almost clear. It's a list of what I cannot touch. Plain child, ugly child, she will find her way a different way. God made her for a reason. It's a list of what I cannot touch. My own hate thick in the air. Words I swallow. I am not, like the German word in the poet's throat. Ich, ich, ich. When my mother brushes my hair and braids it with ribbons, I feel as if I am in disguise, and the disguise is not good enough. It's a list of what I cannot touch: stiffness, pain, the radiating from the center of the bone. It's a list of what I cannot touch: where the desire comes from to remake myself in mirrors, a chipped tooth, tangle of hair at the back of a head, the fact that if I concentrate, I can step straight, but then the steps wind in again, because my natural way is to be crooked. It's a list of what I cannot touch, layers upon layers, like pages put in a box for storage. They yellow, and the ink runs in tiny flecks. The papers disintegrate. And I love the idea of the lost words, the novel where a woman in a jungle writes what she believes is the perfect book and then burns it. I guess I think I'm going to keep reading some new poems just for the heck of it. So this next one I think is I lost my dad this year, and it really made me think about time. I think there's a certain moment when you realize in your body that time is finite, which is a strange thing because we live in a finite linear way, but we also sort of have this sort of infinite imagination. And in certain ways, it's this infinite access into memory. And so this poem is kind of trying to kind of create a spatial feeling of that. And I don't know that it succeeds. Again, this is my high wire part of the reading where I'm just reading these new poems and seeing how they land. And this poem is called Time's Arrow. The present used to feel so real. The future like a field I couldn't see to the end of. Each yellowed birch, each slightly sickly aspen in November, and the sky lit by Orion, forever chasing the wild dogs, his wild sorrow, the biggest thing in all the sky. Now the road thins, my field like a wedge between two lanes of cars speeding away from me. I envy their faith in destination. I am smaller than I thought, and still the skies runneling like waves, my chest beating inside like a frantic drum. I know why birds mistake glass for sky, window for more air, why they fall stunned to the ground, facing briefly a forever landscape they no longer know how to launch themselves into. The loneliness of one quiet stone gleaming with rainwater on a dark asphalt road. And of course, I guess we all know, we've all learned a lot about loss these past few years, and but it's strange losing a parent. And my dad was pretty old and he had a pretty great life. But it was still there is this thing about losing a parent that does feel very, it regrounds you in the world in a completely different way. I don't really know how else to describe it. So I'm going to read a couple of my kind of mourning for my father poems. And it was great, Melissa, to hear your beautiful poems about your mom and time too. I feel like many of us poets are grappling with all these, human beings are grappling with all these things. And this poem is called Love, and I should come up with a better title, but they're all brand new, so I'm testing them out. Here goes. Love. The time the dog slaughtered the raccoon on our back porch and tore it to pieces, my father knew he would be the one to clean up the mess. He didn't hesitate, not entirely. He fetched the supplies, the broom, the bucket, the roll of paper towel. He fetched the bon ami, which we children always viewed tenderly, simply because of its name. And when we woke up for school, he was on his knees, scrubbing the last scraps of blood away. To measure love by what it does is a lesson I am still learning. My father sat still after a long time on the back stoop where the swallows came and went under the eaves, and the chestnut tree with its long candle-like blossoms. Okay, wait, hold on. I gotta kind of pull up the next one here. This poem is also about my dad. He had Parkinson's, which is kind of a long and kind of cruel disease. This poem is also about a story he told me, which I love, and I didn't believe him, except he had snapshots to prove it, that once when he was young and in the Navy, he was asked to kind of babysit a pilot as they flew a helicopter from Jacksonville, Florida to San Diego across the US. And what was sort of great in the snapshots showed is that 50s were kind of empty enough in the US in some ways that when they had to land, they would just land on the highway and they would like drive the helicopter for a while and pull into a gas station and then into a motel, which I find that, so, given how our highways are now, it kind of makes you think about that. I just love that image. It was like, but this poem is called Deep Sea. The numbers have departed from my father, but he can still tell a story of how he once commandeered a gifted drunken pilot from Jacksonville to San Diego by helicopter. They flew in the early mornings over corn and soybean fields, sometimes rolling a time down the highways with the tractors and work trucks, or hovered low to land at gas stations and motels, juke joints and blues joints. My father's hands now are like the deep sea paper skin of fishes we have never seen. He waves them in front of his cataract eyes as though they might disintegrate at any moment. Math has deserted him. When asked to count backwards from 100, he roams further afield than one might ever imagine, swooping through the 10,000s as though exploring a depthless ocean. We used to believe there was nothing down there, but the force of life is its ability to give off its own light, even when there is none. Look how viscerally stars burn in the blank of space and through us. My father wants me to feel the oily heat of those roads stuck in the past, the faded red Fords or Dodges, the men working the fields who had so little they could hold it in their two hands. The pilot struggled with solitary desperations, an antic humor in a crowd, followed by a nightly ritual of holding a loaded gun to his head. My father's job to talk him down. My father said he felt like a swimmer through indigo waters. He was 22. He knew nothing, and so he pretended, which seemed at the time almost enough. The pilot found 10 years later in a motel in Encino. My father says, you don't need to hear that part. He shows me a snapshot, wildly discolored, their blue dragonfly-shaped copter about to touch down on a road lined with live oaks. In the background, a farm stand, someone selling summer tomatoes and peaches, a swirling motion in the air as if all you would need to do was touch it to go there. What is it to breathe light into the darkest spaces of the world, down where voices mean nothing, where it is always night and always snowing? I guess I'll read a couple more from Radium Dream. I've totally lost track of time. I don't know how many minutes I've been reading, but I'll read a few more from, I think I'll read the title from Radium Dream, which a lot of which is set in New Mexico, where I lived for a long time, and has kind of a remarkable landscape and feeling. And this poem is set, by the way, in right around Socorro, New Mexico, which kind of echoes back to some of the poems Melissa was reading. There's a place called Bosque del Apache where cranes come in November. So this is a winter poem, I guess. And they arrive again in what feels like the tens of thousands. And I'm not, and they're they come, and there's another place in Southern Oregon where I've also been, the Malheur Refuge, where the same thing happens. And it's really extraordinary. And this poem is kind of about that, and kind of also about, in a weird way, the New Mexico was where all the nuclear test sites happened, and still suffers in many ways from uranium and the water and the fallout from that, which feels like something we're dealing, those kinds of sense of something being infiltrated, or seems to be part of what we're all dealing with in our time. Radium Dream. We come at the wrong time of year by a hair or a week, and the brown birds flying onward out of reach. My son tilts his head. A minor starburst of cranes lights the far corner of the sky. Stragglers, fewer than expected, but enough to glitter the air with strangeness. These birds with their necks not tucked in, forming their odd cries. When they land by the shore, their toothpick legs appear hardly enough to hold up their robust bodies. Often, I think, that's not really happening, is it? As though I were acting in a film or a vision of a life. On the highway, they warn us not to drink. Too much uranium leached down from the abandoned mines. The cranes twist their necks to stab the quick light of fish. Do cranes know how to swim? And why is swimming so different than flying? Now, aloft again, they apparate with uncanny quickness into cloud. How does the eye lose them? Is it how high they rise? The bones in my son's hand, they tell me, have stopped growing too early. They act like this is a problem, but I have radium dreams, a brightness, him, me, you, the cranes, and in them, nothing dies. I think I'm just going to read one more because I feel like I read such intense poems that I'm not sure, that I can kind of
give us a couple more.
Okay, I'll give a couple more. If I'm going to give a couple more, okay, yeah. I guess I'll read a couple more from this book. Maybe I will read, let me just find this one. This is a winter poem, so it's a good penultimate poem, and it's kind of I guess what this poem is about is it's about what the title says. It's called Getting Over It, and that's kind of what it's about. Consider it a lesson. Here is how you make soup. It is like the stars, a broth of ghosts and bone. It is good to inhale the steam that rises from the pot, the rich mulch of long fallow, dear departed. In the mirror, a wrinkle cuts my face in two. I don't care, don't even pine. I get out the clean cutting board and chop an onion into tiny squares. I look as if I've been frowning a long time. I know you were the last one, the way a person might have one bird for a whole season, a dove that cries in a peculiar way, or the cardinal flashing just now outside a window. I turn up the flame and the onion's brown. The broth is better if it tastes a little burned, the floating unnameable, like those funny pictures of bone in which the bones appear to shine which is only a trick of radium, that dangerous but beautiful element one would never put in soup. And the woman who plunged her hands into it until her skin peeled off, until she was possessed by a truly terrible weariness. She wanted to know the way love would immortalize every butterfly, put it into a sky of blue velvet, and will it to fly even into winter. And I guess the last poem I'll read in that case is the last poem in the chapbook, which is called Love Soldier. And I guess what the poems have in common is that sense of a little bit of world weariness, but also like a determination to go on, which feels fitting for a solstice reading, because I'm so curious, Melissa, why it's your favorite holiday. It's kind of mine too, but I'm kind of trying to figure out why. There's something really inspiring and exciting about getting to the shortest day and feeling like you know it's going to rise up again, like the light's going to get larger again, but you're sort of living through this darkness. And I think that there's something kind of bracing about that. And I think that this poem kind of, in its own weird abstract way, kind of speaks to that. And what was kind of cool about writing this book was I did it all in the early days of the pandemic, when we all suddenly were just at home, and it felt like, later the pandemic kind of became more familiar in its awfulness, but in that beginning period, there was just this sort of hushed sense of awareness that was terrifying and also kind of oddly bracing. Like, I think it was a time when we all sort of took stock and in certain ways readjusted our priorities in some ways, or at least it felt that way to me at the time. And so this poem again, Love Soldier. I would lie if I said I wasn't curious, the way any rough border tempts the hand to feel what is torn or stitched. What is darker than blood, or more ecstatic than finding yourself inside a body covered in dew? I practice the rigors of wire, cage. Consider the mud wash of your dulled eyes, like marbles set to roll and strike across the dust of a floor. You use only the smallest words, and I notice this, and I let the echoes settle, like birds descending down into a chimney, the whirl they form, able to barely touch, even when the flocks multiply, as each heart is called. Thank you. Thank you.